The rabbi said, one of them said, the New York rabbi said, you know what, you shouldn't be taking your religion to religious people and trying to change their religious views. If you want to go, peddle your religion somewhere, go to the people who don't have any religion. We already got one, leave us alone. Now, whose view was that being expressed there? The rabbi's view, right? It was his view about evangelism, basically. It was his religious viewpoint about religious promulgation. What was going on here? He was objecting that the Christians were trying to change his point of view by saying that he was wrong and he should adopt their view. And what was his response? No, the other is true. You Christians are wrong in following the Great Commission of your Savior, and you ought to adopt my religious view about evangelism. The fact is, he was doing exactly the same thing that he was complaining the Christians ought not do. I had a student come to me once who was going to university kind of like this, and she said, I talked to my anthropology professor, and my anthropology professor was very supportive of me in my Christianity. And then I told her that I was really interested in becoming a missionary, and that upset my professor a lot. And she said to me, it's wrong for you to try to go out and change other people's religious views. And so she came to me, or she might have called me on the radio, and she said, how do I respond to that? I said, you go back to your professor and you ask the professor this question. Maybe some of you have already thought of this. Are you trying to what? Change my religious views. You see, the professor was again doing the very thing that she was telling the student not to do. What does this demonstrate? That the professor is wrong? No. That the rabbis are wrong? No. The point is they're not neutral. It doesn't matter what side theologically you come down on, whether you believe that the Jewish view of the world is correct or the Christian view. That's not my point. My point is everybody's got a point of view, and they think they're right, and they're arguing for that, but one group largely is posturing as if they're neutral, and they're not. When it comes to the moral questions, there is no place of genuine neutrality except for silence. You want to be really neutral, morally speaking, if you are really a moral relativist, the only thing that you have at your disposal that is consistent with moral neutrality is silence. The minute you open your mouth in the face of any egregious moral wrong and make a moral recommendation, you have violated your neutrality, you have taken a moral position, and you have affirmed the existence of moral absolutes at that point. Unless, of course, you're very careful to say, but this is just my personal preference. My preference is that that's wrong, but I'm not condemning you. And then the question can be raised, then why are you talking at all? If this is just your preference, why should I care whether you like broccoli or Brussels sprouts? It's irrelevant, right? But hidden in there is the kind of the assumption that you have a moral obligation to care about what I care about. So the morality is smuggled in the back door there. No, if we are going to be consistent relativists, then we can't make any moral judgments whatsoever. And a lot of folks are very inconsistent here. They don't want moral judgments against them, but they want moral judgments in favor of them. Do you know that good is a moral judgment as well? I'm really looking forward to the time when somebody who I've had a discussion with about moral relativism comes up to me and says, after they've made their case against morality or objective morality, and then they said, I saw what you did over to that person as you're talking to that person who's really having a hard time. That was really good of you to do that. And then I could say, how dare you push your morality on me? Because good is a moral judgment just like bad is. And if there are no morals that are objective in any sense, then the word good is just as meaningless as the word bad. Well, that's not neutral. That is the aggressive promotion of a particular point of view called moral relativism. Now that deals with, I think, to a great degree, this problem of apparent neutrality, which there isn't any, and the tolerance that's attached to it. Because the challenge of intolerance is also itself a moral challenge. It's a claim that some moral thing is true, that is, the rule that you ought to tolerate, whatever that means, and the meaning of that has shifted over the years, to almost mean the opposite now is what it used to mean, by the way. But it still carries, in the minds of many people, the same moral imperative. So that if you're intolerant, you've done something what? Wrong. And wrong is a moral term. And if you're a relativist, then you can't have any kind of thing wrong. Now, I'd like to give you a handful of flaws in relativism. Before I do that, though, I want to I want to clarify something here about the whole issue, because I keep using this term moral to describe relativism. We call it moral relativism. The reason I do that is because that is the terminology in the field, as it were, to describe it. But I don't want you to misunderstand the nature of moral relativism as if it is a moral alternative. That is an alternative way of thinking morally about moral rules, because it turns out that relativism is not a refinement of how we understand morality. It is a denial of how we understand morality. And I'm going to give you a very simple illustration to show how this is true. You can judge the validity of a moral principle by looking at the principle in action, as it were. Finding the person who is the best exemplar of that principle, who is something like the hero of the principle, who lives it out to something like perfection, and by gazing at the individual themselves, you can, in the presence of virtue, if it's there, commends the moral principle that helped this person to become that way. For example, if your moral principle is you should always help other people in need at all times and take no thought for your own needs. Well, what does a person look like who lives that out to something like perfection? Well, you live like that and it produces a Mother Teresa. You behold a Mother Teresa and you can see the obvious virtue in her life. And as a result, you think that must be a pretty good moral rule that produces this kind of individual. Or you could say that whenever you have to resist the government, you do so with nonviolent passive resistance. And that living that out to some kind of perfection, the moral hero of that view might be a Gandhi or Dr. Martin Luther King. If your moral view is you should always obey the Father in heaven in everything that you do, you see a person who lives this out to perfection, it produces a Jesus Christ. And you say, Jesus Christ, moral rule. It must be a pretty good moral rule that produces this kind of human being. Okay, that's our motif. How does that apply to relativism? So my question is, what is the champion of relativism? What is the hero of relativism? What is the kind of person that lives according to the dictates of relativism most consistently? And we have a word for that kind of person in the English language, a person who has no concern for other people's idea of right and wrong, who follows his or her own views of right and wrong, and marches most consistently to the beat of their own moral drum. It's a homicide detective's worst nightmare. It's a person without a conscience, sociopath. Now, friends, there's got to be something wrong with an appropriate, with a possible or offered point of view, moral point of view of relativism, that it produces as its logical result, as its purpose, not as a wild spin-off, not as like, well, everybody gets a little strange one now, but this is the goal. Produces a sociopath. And this is why we don't teach relativism to our kids. We like it for ourselves, but we don't teach our kids that. And this is why relativism has been rejected by every single moral leader in the history of the world that stood head or shoulders above anyone else. You take whoever you want. You can take Moses, you can take Krishna, you can take Buddha, you can take Jesus Christ, you can take the Apostle Paul, you can take Aristotle, you can take Martin Luther King. Whoever stood head and shoulders above them all condemned this as immoral. The person who's a relativist has no morality, period. Now, I know this is offensive to some people. They say, well, they don't like someone taking the moral label away from them. And they'll say things, how dare you say that? I have my morality. I do whatever's right for me. That's my morality. That's my point. Because morality isn't doing whatever's right for you. Morality is doing what's right, trying to figure out what's right and then doing it. That's morality. Okay, now this kind of introduces us to this whole concept and to the problem with moral neutrality and the problem with tolerance and even the problem with calling relativism moral, because it's a denial of morality, not a version of morality. Using something that's called an intuition. Now, when I say intuition, I mean something particular. I don't mean like women's intuition or the ability that some people have when they're in a field for a long time to come up with a quick answer. If you're a doctor, you've done it so often that you just kind of take a look at the circumstances and subconsciously all your learning comes to play and you come up with a diagnosis and it may be right because you're just good at this. after learning. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a way of knowing something that you don't know how you knew it, a way of knowing that's built in. From a philosophical perspective, this way of knowing is right on the very bottom tier. You don't get to this knowledge by some other means. It's just there. For example, I say to you, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is moral. See? Now, how did you know that? I've done this dozens and dozens of times with different audiences, not always a stellar educated group like this here at UCLA, but just normal folk. And they come up with the answer. How did they know that? And if I pressed you on that, you would say, I don't know, you can just see it, right? You can just, if you know the meaning of the first two things, and that makes sense, then the other just follows. And if I asked you to prove that to me, that it follows, you would be at wit's end to do so, because you'd say, well, that is the proof. That if you don't see it, I don't even know how I get there if it's not obvious to you. Frankly, if I said that I didn't see that, you would probably think there was something wrong with me. Like, you know, come on, what is it? What's missing up there, right? If I said that Mary is shorter than Bob and Bob is shorter than Bill, what would I know about Mary to Bill? That she was shorter. Right, okay, so I gave you a little help because this is mostly undergraduates here, so I gave you some help. But you would have figured it out even if I hadn't done the visual, if you understand the words. Now, these are examples of, that's the transitive relationship, I think, right? These are examples of rational intuitions. These are things that you kind of got built in there and that operate without any justification. Now, I think there are not only rational intuitions, I think there are moral intuitions as well. They're moral intuitions that inform our behavior and inform our language. And they pop up all the time. My point simply here is, if these moral intuitions are misinformed, if there is no objective morality, then the things that inform our moral intuitions turn out to be nonsense. So we might say something like, rape is wrong. All right, and why would we condemn rape if we didn't have a moral intuition that rape is somehow morally objectionable? Actually so, not just to us, you know, but actually wrong in itself. And by the way, when I'm arguing the basis of moral intuitions, I don't really bear a burden of proof here. What I'm trying to do is appeal to something that I think you already know. And so I'm not going to prove, other than making this appeal to intuition, the points that that will follow. For example, if you told me, well, it's not clear to me that rape is wrong, my response is not going to be, well, I think you have an interesting alternate morality. My response is going to be, get help. I mean, something's wrong with you, it seems to me, if this is not a self-presenting moral principle. Now, I'm not just simply going to assert that, though. I think, by and large, you folks believe this. And this is what I meant by Christianity resonating, the principles and the worldview of Christianity and the view of Jesus resonating with our deepest intuitions about the world. Because I'm not trying to persuade you of this. I think you already believe it. And I think you believe it because of the way you talk about the nature of the world. And I'm going to give you some examples about the way you talk about things that evidence your deep commitment to objective morality. And this makes up the 7 fatal flaws or whatever. I'm just going to give you 3 or 4 of them. First of all, if a person is a relativist, he must surrender all language that pertains to moral wrongdoing. That is, a relativist can never say, that person did something wrong. Now, he might be able to say, I didn't like what happened. I wouldn't do that if I were him. It's not my cup of tea. But he could never offer a legitimate judgment on anyone else for anything being wrong. It would be like saying you broke a rule in a game that has no rules. You know, what if your game that you're playing has the whole earth, this is the whole earth, there's no boundaries. You say, hey, you're out of bounds. You say, what do you mean out of bounds? There's no boundaries in this game. By the same token, when you say there are no moral rules and then you claim somebody's wrong, that's like saying they've gone out of bounds in a game that has no boundaries. It's nonsense. And what's going to happen then is you're going to have to bite the bullet and acknowledge that people like Hitler and Pol Pot and Idi Amin and the rest of them were completely within their moral rights, as it were, to do whatever they preferred in the moment as long as they had the power to accomplish it. You couldn't say they were wrong, because wrong is violating a moral rule, and if your view is that there are no moral rules, you can't say they're violating them. Now, you just have to ask yourself, friends, the question, does it seem like there are some things that it's appropriate to say, that's just wrong? I don't care what anybody says. That's just wrong. If you feel justified in virtue of your moral intuition to use the word wrong in that way, and by the way, everybody does, that's why they use it so often, then relativism must be false. Here's another flaw. Very few people have even thought about this. If relativism is true, you could never, ever complain about the problem of evil in the world. Now you think about that for a moment. One of the regular, probably the most tenacious objections to what Jesus believed is the objection of evil in the world. How could there be a good and loving God if there's all this evil in the world? Now, do you realize that the objection, first of all, it's a fair objection. I fully sympathize with it, and it needs to be addressed. And I think it can be. We have some teaching on it. And others have talked about, I think Bill Craig was here, Dr. William Lane Craig was here last year, and he spoke on it as well. But there are answers to it. But what's interesting to me is that the question is raised at all. And what does it tell us about the nature of our beliefs about the universe if we raise the question? You Christians must be wrong because there's evil in the world, and you say God is good. And my first question is going to be, what is it? Can you help me out a little bit here and help me understand what it is that you mean by evil in the world? You see, for this objection to be sustained, to even be spoken, there's got to be evil in the world. There's got to be objective evil, not just our subjective preferences. You know, just about 2 years ago, I think almost this week, we had this ghastly shooting in Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado. And 2 members of the Trenchcoat Mafia, high school students, came in at lunchtime, guns blaring, tossing pipe bombs left and right. When the dust settled and the smoke cleared, 14 kids were dead. The 2 shooters had taken their life. A teacher was dead also. That happened on a Tuesday around noontime. The following Monday, I was at Long Beach City College in a debate on Christianity versus atheism. What do you think came up in the discussion? What was on the headlines of every newspaper around the country for that whole week? In fact, the LA Times headline in the Metro section said, "Where was God?" Now, it's interesting, given that response, and like I said, I'm sympathetic to that response. I understand how people can raise that question, but what is necessary to be in place for someone to legitimately raise that objection is a commitment to the idea that there is evil in the world, and this is an example of it. Because if there is no God and there is no morality, if relativism is the right way to look at it, there are a lot of things you could say about what happened at Littleton, Colorado in that spring of 1999. Oh, you could say that really upset me. I didn't like that. I wish it hadn't happened. I would never do something like that. You could talk about all these things that turn out to be reporting of personal autobiography. But one thing you could never say, if morals are relative, is that what happened at Littleton, Colorado was evil. You could never say it was wicked. And if we say that that was wicked and that was evil, or anything else like it, and there are many examples, then that objection can only make sense if morals are objective in some sense and relativism is false. And you can go down the line. What about justice and fairness? Do we complain about the lack of justice in the legal system? Well, what is justice? Justice is a moral good, an objective moral good that we ought to obey. It's wrong to punish the innocent in virtue of his innocence and to let the guilty go free in virtue of his guilt. I mean, this is just obviously unjust. And this is why when we see things like that, the word injustice comes out of our mouth just like that. And many other words like them, because we are spontaneously making moral judgments about circumstances that we understand to have moral qualities to them. That's not fair. Well, if you're a relativist, this is nonsense. Because fairness is a moral good, a moral obligation. And if there are no moral obligations, then the word fairness not only is like wrong or false, it's incoherent. It doesn't point to anything. It's just like blabbity blab. You might as well just say that. Oh, that's blabbity blab. Because it doesn't have any more meaning. Now, why do we chuckle? Because we know that justice and fairness are not blabbity blab kind of things, right? That there is a moral intuition that we have about the nature of the world that is informing our language. And that if we hold to our relativism, then we must acknowledge that the language that we're using to describe all of these things is nonsense. And you can go right down the line. I said I had 8 of them. Here's one more. If you're a relativist, you cannot demand tolerance. Because the moral obligation of tolerance doesn't make any sense at all in a relativistic worldview. It certainly makes sense in my worldview, but that's because I think that there are things that are right and wrong. It's not just my opinion. I mean, if I'm intolerant, then I'm wrong. Even if I happen to like it. Even if I happen to approve of it. Even if I don't believe in that view, I still am judged wrong because the rule of tolerance is an objective thing that applies to everyone in the same situation. And if it turns out that relativism is true, then we live in a world in which nothing is wrong, nothing is evil, nothing is worthy of praise or blame. There is no justice or injustice, in which there is no tolerance. And I promise you something, friends, a world that promotes relativism will produce that kind of world. This is why we subtitled the book, Feet Firmly Planted in Midair. And I'm going to let you in here in just kind of my closing remarks before our Q&A. A little secret about this whole thing. I know some of you are thinking, well, who could really believe that kind of thing? Who could live that way? Here's my answer. Nobody can and nobody does. You almost never find a real relativist. Oh, people can talk this way, but they can't live this way. They know better. And so you could be talking to somebody, in the line at the bank or something, and you're trying to argue for some type of absolute morality, and they're promoting their relativism, and they're waxing eloquent about it, and then somebody cuts in front of them in line, right? And they say, hey, back of the line, you shouldn't do that. Now, they don't then add, and by the way, that's just my personal moral view. It has nothing to do with you, so please just ignore my comment. No, they think the person actually did something wrong, don't they? And so they'll wax eloquent about moral relativism, and then in the next breath complain about somebody cutting in line, talk about the injustice of the legal system, talk about unfairness at work, talk about those arrogant, narrow-minded, bigoted fundamentalists who are cramming their truth down our throats, all of which are nonsense if it turns out that relativism is true. I don't think they're nonsense. I don't think you think they're nonsense either. And if that's the case, then relativism must be false. And it kind of the fact that it's false kind of expresses itself in odd ways in our conversation, even from people who consider themselves dyed-in-the-wool relativists, who are the quickest to respond, don't judge me, or who are you to tell me what I should do, or don't push your morality on me. I had a conversation in the same chiropractor's office with a young man named Gil, and this whole conversation's in the book. And Gil was a real nice guy, easygoing, didn't hold to my view of the world at all, but he was willing to talk about it. And so in the process of me getting physical therapy, we talked about spiritual things. And at one point, and he's very easygoing and very tolerant type, right? Until it got to the point where in the conversation about moral issues, it became clear that I thought homosexuality was immoral. Oh, no, he didn't like that. Now, I wasn't, beating up on anybody. I was just making a point. And he didn't like that. He said, you Christians, a lot of you guys are nice people, and get a lot of things to like about you, but before long you start getting judgmental. Now, Gil didn't realize it, but he just made a big mistake. And so I was going to try to help him to see his mistake, and by asking him a question. I said, okay, Gil, well, I don't understand why you're angry. What's wrong with what I did? And he goes, I'm overacting here a little bit to make the point. He said, you were judging, and it's not right to judge. Well, what is that? And I said, well, Gil, if it's not right to judge, then why are you judging me right now? Now, he had never, ever heard anything like that before. And he kind of drops back a few steps there, and he's rubbing his chin, trying to regroup a little bit. I said, what the heck was that? All right. And I can hear him kind of mumbling under his breath as he's trying to, no, that's not what, stop and start. And finally he says, all right, well, I guess I was judging you. You're right. I guess it's okay to judge. That's what he said. He didn't want to give up his judgment, He said, I guess it's okay to judge. And then he adds this caveat. He says, as long as you don't push your morality on other people. Once you push your morality, you've crossed the line. You can judge, but don't push your morality. Now, he thought he'd improved his lot. He just went out of the frying pan into the fire. Because then I was ready with another question. What do you think my question was? Gil, is that your morality? What you've just expressed to me, that you shouldn't push your morality on other people. He said, yeah. He didn't see it coming. I said, then why are you pushing it on me right now? Oh, yeah, let's see. He says, he's rubbing his chin again. Finally, he makes a couple other false starts, and he can't get going, you know. And finally, he says, it's not fair. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I can't find a way to say it in which it sounds right. He thought I was playing a word trick on him, you know. I said, Gil, it doesn't sound right because it's not right. It's self-refuting. It's like you're saying there are no moral rules. Here's one. Okay? Yeah, and sometimes I have these kind of conversations with people, and they'll get all frustrated, and they'll say, well, now you got me all confused, you know. I said, no, I think you were a little confused when you started. You just now figured that out, you know. This is characteristic of a lot of people who want to champion relativism and at the same time cannot avoid making moral judgments. This is kind of like passive-aggressive. You know what passive-aggressive is? When people say two different things at the same time. They say they say something loudly and they say the second thing quietly. And it's the quiet thing that's really true. So like a gal will say, yeah, you know, I got divorced last year, but I'm completely over it. I don't hold any grudges against that jerk. Okay, see, there's passive-aggressive there. So which part is true? I don't hold any grudges or the jerk part? The jerk part is what she really believes. That's the way passive-aggressive works. Well, this is kind of a passive-aggressive. There are no moral rules, therefore you shouldn't judge me. Well, if there are no moral rules, then how can there be the moral rule that you shouldn't judge other people? There is no truth, therefore you ought to tolerate different views. Well, if there's no truth, then there's no moral truth that you ought to tolerate different points of view. It's a good reason to do whatever you want if there is no morality. So when people ask me, they say to me, don't push your morality on me, I say, why not? Now see that silence right there? That's what I get back. Because there's no way for them to answer that without at the same time doing what? Pushing their morality on me. You see, people believe in morality so deeply that it comes out even when they're trying to deny it. Now, if relativism is false, and I think it's a bankrupt view, and I've given you some reasons why I think that's the case, then that means some form of moral objectivism's got to be true. Maybe there's only one, and I'm not promoting any particular view right now. Maybe there's only one moral rule in the whole world, and that moral view is that you shouldn't torture that moral rule is you shouldn't torture babies for fun, or it's wrong to gay bash, or intolerance is wrong, or I mean, pick whatever your favorite thing is. If there is only one moral principle in the universe, we have just made an unbelievable discovery. In the process of reflecting on the nature of the world, we have discovered a moral rule, some moral obligation that applies to us as human beings that is not physical. I mean, you can ask yourself the question, what the heck is a moral rule? But one thing it isn't something you're going to bump into in the dark. It doesn't extend in space. It doesn't have physical qualities. You can't examine it by physics. It's something that science has no access to in principle. But it's something we know just the same to be so. Now, if it turns out that there's one non-physical reality that science can't speak to, but we can actually know, it might be that there's a whole bunch of other things that are non-physical, that are inaccessible to science, even in principle, but are still things we can be reasonably certain of. And that's the liberating idea I want to leave you with. If there is morality in the world, and it's appropriate under some circumstances to demand tolerance from people, and to require that human beings not be mistreated, well, then we've got to ask ourselves, what gives force to this moral obligation? If the moral obligation is just an accident, well, I don't know why we should obey it, frankly. When we look at the nature of laws, even in our own societies, moral obligations are things that pass between minds. You might have a moral obligation to me, but you don't have a moral obligation to a disembodied principle that's just floating around in the universe. And I want to suggest to you that the best explanation for the existence of moral rules that we're all aware of in some measure, and there might be some debate about the details, which is okay, but foundationally there are some moral rules in place. The best explanation is not is not going to be relativism, which is denial of moral rules. It's not going to be that moral rules just happen by chance, but rather they didn't happen by chance. They happened by non-chance. In other words, they're functions of mind. Someone is behind the moral rules. Some moral ruler is responsible for the moral rules themselves. And that means when we break a moral rule, we're not just violating a principle, but we are offending the one who made the rule. Now, this may be a new concept to some of you, but I just want you to stay with me for a moment. Because if that's the case, and it certainly seems to be in the running to me, I could be wrong about this, but I've done a lot of thinking about it, and I don't think there's a better explanation. This fits with the way we understand how moral rules or how rules and obligations work across the board. They're functions of mind. And if we have transcendent moral rules that apply to all human beings, this seems to suggest a transcendent mind behind it. Therefore, when we violate the moral rules, we are offending the moral rule maker, and this begins to explain something. I know something that's true about every single person in this room that you don't know that I know. And you think most people don't know. And here's what it is. I know that you struggle with a bad self-image. Now, how do I know that? Because everybody does. In some measure, including me. What happens is we look down inside of ourselves and we see what's there, what nobody else sees, and the thing we see, to some degree, is something we do not like, and we know that what we see that we don't like is moral. Something's wrong with us. And we try to hide it. We try to deny it. We try to pretend it's not there, but when we're alone, in our secret moments, we know for sure it's real. And we do all kinds of things to compensate. And one way to compensate is just to simply deny it. That's relativism. The answer to guilt, that's what you're feeling, is not denial. I'd like to suggest that the answer to guilt is forgiveness. Did you ever consider that maybe the reason you feel guilty is because you are guilty? I mean, is that possible? Is that within the range of possibilities? And that's why we hunger to have forgiveness, to get out from underneath this. And this is where Jesus comes in. You see, we're talking about relativism and about a philosophic issue in ethics, but it cashes out in very real terms to us. Because as we reflect on our own lives, we realize that this is something we actually believe in. This is something Jesus believed in too. We also believe in our own sense of personal guilt. We have an obligation for having violated the very laws that we say are in place and apply to human beings, and that means we're in trouble. And what Jesus offers is a solution that works. Because we haven't just broken the rule, we have offended the rule maker, and the rule maker became a man in order to make a payment to make your forgiveness possible. There are a lot of ways to characterize that, and you probably heard different ways, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that now. I just want you to see that this whole thing about morality relates to the basic message that has to do with following Christ. This whole thing about sin and guilt wasn't just something make me up to drum up new business. Jesus is a physician that came to heal a sickness that all of us have, and that I think we're all aware of in our honest moments. And I encourage you to give the healer serious consideration for your deadly condition. Well, that's all I have to say of a formal nature. I think that, first of all, there's nothing incoherent about Christianity. And indeed, the Christian story, if we understand it correctly, holds together wonderfully. And here I'm going to give you a very, very quick kind of Christianity, the Christian worldview in a nutshell. All right? 5 simple points. 5 words that kind of capture the Christian worldview. First, God. Second, man. Third, Jesus. Fourth, the cross. And fifth, resurrection. Those are the bones of the Christian story, if you will. In other words, God exists and is the creator of everything else from nothing else. Since He created everything else, He owns it. And you and I are appropriate subjects in His kingdom. First point. Man. Who and what is man? Man is a finite creature. Though made like God in an important way, he's not God. Therefore, he has transcendent value, but something has gone wrong. He is broken. He is twisted. He is in rebellion against God, and because of that, God's anger falls upon the rebel. 3, the response, Jesus. God becomes a man in the person of Jesus. to rescue us. And he does that in two ways. One, making a trade by taking on our crimes or the penalty for that and paying the penalty for that and giving to us all the good things that he merits. And then secondly, by invading our lives in a good way and begin to make us the kind of people that God wanted us to be in the first place. Receive the pardon, will be forgiven. And then at the end of the age, at the resurrection, all human beings are raised from the dead to live forever. Everybody lives forever in the Christian story. God divides up those who have received the pardon so that they spend eternity with him and all the goodness that he wants for them, and those who have rejected his pardon are banished forever from his kingdom and away from the presence of his power and glory. That's the Christian story. You know something? There is nothing incoherent about that. It flows logically and seamlessly from beginning to end. Not only that, it resonates with our deepest intuitions about the way we've discovered the world to be. And this brings us to our second principle. So our first principle is that true views hold together without contradiction. The second principle is true views fit the world that we discover through observation. The universe not only exists as separate from us, but something about that universe can be detected, and that is that the universe is designed. Now, this is something that can no longer be denied. And I don't know if you've been following the intelligent design movement or any of the other contributions that other Christian groups have made to this enterprise. In fact, actually, some of the most powerful information has not been contributed by those who have a theological axe to grind, if you will. The whole scientific community is caught up in this issue. The fine-tuned constants of the universe. If you read the book or saw the DVD, The Privileged Planet, you realize that this whole universe and our entire solar system are all minutely balanced in a very particular way to favor the existence of complex life right here on our planet at this particular time. It's so compelling, in fact, that the evidence that the 20th century's most notorious atheist, the philosopher Antony Flew, actually changed his mind in the 8th decade of his life and became a theist. In fact, I'm reading his book right now. The title of it is There Is a God. And he gives his reasons, and one of the reasons is because the universe has obviously been tampered with. The fingerprints of God are everywhere. And whatever view that you have of religion has got to take that into consideration. So the world exists, pretty obvious. The world is designed, can't avoid that anymore. The world is a world that is thick with morality. It is thick with morality. I wrote a book on relativism to refute the idea that morality is just an illusion. It's called Relativism, Feet Firmly Planted in Midair. Dr. Frank Beckwith and I did the book together. And one of the things that I argue in the book, basically, against relativism is, though it's the knee-jerk reaction of most people to be relativists nowadays, there is no objective morality, there is no right and wrong. It turns out I have never, ever met a real relativist. And I hope I never do. I do not want to meet the person who believes that there is no right and wrong, but the only thing that informs his behavior is his own desires and preferences and the power that he has to get what he wants, because that kind of person is dangerous. Now, people say that they don't believe in morality, but the minute they say that, they take it away right away. Like, there is no morality, therefore it's wrong for you to push your moral views on me. In other words, there are no moral rules. Here's one. People do this all the time. In fact, whenever I talk to somebody who claims to be a relativist, all I do is listen to their language to see to see that they actually demonstrate with their language that they believe in morality. In fact, every single debate that I've been in on this issue, and I've been in like 5 or 6 of them on different campuses around the country, I tell my audience, I said, one way that I'll win the debate is by giving good arguments in favor of objective morality. But there's another way that I can win, in a sense, by default. If my opponent assumes my view to make her or his view. In other words, if in trying to argue against morality, they assume morality, then I win. And I tell the audience, I want you to listen very, very carefully to the words that they use, because their words are going to betray them. And where do you think the person is that's debating me while I'm telling the audience to listen to the words of my opponent, that they're going to make my view for me? They're seated right there. They're not in a soundproof booth. But nevertheless, every single time I make my case, I sit down, they get up to make their case, and they start talking about their view about relativism, and before long, certain words start creeping into their vocabulary. Words like intolerant, and judgmental, and oppressive. Notice that these are moral terms. And so during my debate, and when I do my rebuttal, all I have to do is just quote back to them everything that they've said that trade on objective moral concepts. They're actually using my worldview to try to defeat my worldview. What this demonstrates, friends, is that morality is so deeply entrenched in people that they cannot deny it even when they try. Which is why, by the way, people complain constantly about the problem of evil. The problem of evil is only a problem for theists to deal with if there is evil. Pretty straightforward. But there can't be evil if there is no morality. So if you have a view of the world that's reflected in your religious point of view, you have to take that into consideration as well, right, wrong, or objectively true concepts, and show how that fits into your whole picture.